Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment before we begin to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Soften your jaw. Let the day go. Tonight we are going to travel slowly through the long story of one of the strangest and most beautiful civilizations the human species has ever produced. The Maya, a people who, for nearly 3,000 years, occupied a tropical lowland country in the southern part of what is now Mexico, along with the modern nations of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. A people who built, in that humid forested country, more than 40 stone cities, pyramid temples, palace complexes, ball courts, plazas, observatories, many of which were eventually overgrown by jungle and forgotten by their own descendants. A people who developed, on their own, without any apparent contact with the great civilizations of the Old World, a complete system of writing, the most sophisticated mathematics anywhere in the Americas, an astronomical observation tradition more accurate than any Old World system before the modern era, and a calendar that ran continuously, day by day, for over 5,000 years. A people who, around 1,200 years ago, in a process that we still do not entirely understand, simply abandoned most of their great cities. The cities did not fall to invasion. They were not destroyed by some dramatic catastrophe in any single moment. They were instead gradually emptied out, building by building, generation by generation, until, sometime in the 10th century, the central lowlands where the largest of them had stood, were nearly empty of population. The forest grew back, the temples were absorbed by trees, the painted plaster cracked and faded, the stelae, the carved upright stones that recorded the dates and deeds of long lines of kings, fell down, or were buried. The hieroglyphic writing, after about 900 AD, was no longer being carved on any monument anywhere. This is the great classic Maya collapse. It is one of the most discussed and most contested episodes in all of human history. We will spend, tonight, some time on it. But the story is much larger than the collapse. The Maya did not in fact vanish. They retreated, regathered and reorganized. They survived in different forms, in the Yucatan to the north, in the Guatemalan highlands to the south. They were conquered, eventually, by Spaniards in the 16th century. They survived the conquest. They were converted to Christianity, mostly. They survived the conversion. There are today, somewhere between 6 and 8 million speakers of Mayan languages alive in southern Mexico and Central America. Their classical hieroglyphic writing system, which had been unreadable for almost 1,000 years, was finally deciphered by an extraordinary international scholarly effort in the second half of the 20th century. We can now read what their kings wrote about themselves, 1,500 years ago, in the great cities of the lowland forest. There is no urgency to any of this. The Maya, like every civilization we have followed in these long evenings, lived in slow time. Their calendar measured in 20-year periods, in 400-year periods, in greater periods of nearly 490,000 years, so you also do not need to hurry. You can let the names drift past. You can let the dates blur. You can fall asleep at any moment. The story will keep going, just as the jungle kept going, with or without anyone watching. It is a morning in 750 after Christ. The country is the Chichén, a low-lying region of tropical forest, in what is now northern Guatemala, on the border with southern Mexico and Belize. The sun has just risen. The air is warm, already, even at this early hour. There is a thin mist rising off the surface of a small reservoir at the southern edge of the city we now call Tikal. Birds are calling. Somewhere, deep in the surrounding forest, a howler monkey is making its strange, distant, throbbing roar. The city of Tikal is, in this particular morning, perhaps the largest urban center anywhere in the Americas. By the most recent estimates, 60 to 90,000 people live in its central area, with several 100,000 more in its supporting agricultural hinterland. The central core of the city is composed of vast paved plazas, surrounded by stone temple pyramids that rise as much as 200 feet above the forest canopy. The two largest pyramids, what archaeologists now call Temple 1 and Temple 2, face each other across the Great Plaza, both of them faced in finely cut limestone, both of them topped by elaborate roof comb sculptures whose plaster decorations have, until very recently, been brightly painted in red, blue and white. Around the plazas extend palace complexes, residential districts, ball courts, causeways, and the homes of nobles and priests. Beyond those, in concentric zones of decreasing density, stretch the homes of farmers, craftsmen, traders. Beyond all of that, in every direction, is the forest. A network of swamps and ridges and seasonal wetlands and fertile patches of upland soil that have over centuries been cleared and cultivated and allowed to regrow in long rotations of milpa agriculture, the same patient slash-and-burn pattern still practiced by Maya farmers in the Petén tonight. The king of Tikal, in this particular year, is a man named Chichén Itzá. He is the 27th king of his line, the Sak-Hix-Mut dynasty, by the count that the Tikal stele will eventually preserve for us. He inherited the throne from his father, Chichén Itzá, the king who built the great twin pyramids that face each other across the plaza, the king who finally defeated the rival city of Calakmul and ushered in a 50-year period of Tikal supremacy in the central lowlands. Chichén Itzá himself is buried in a tomb deep inside Temple 1, beneath the pyramid we are looking at this morning. His tomb has been sealed for 15 years. It will not be opened, unbroken, until 1962 of our calendar. The Maya world this morning extends, geographically, from southern Mexico to El Salvador. It is divided, politically, into perhaps 50 independent kingdoms, each ruled by its own divine king, each constantly negotiating, warring, marrying and trading with its neighbors. There is no overall Maya empire. There is no Maya emperor. There has never been one. The Maya world is, and has always been, plural, a network of distinct city-states, sharing a common language family, a common calendar, a common script, a common cosmological vocabulary, but no central political authority. In some ways, this is the high noon of Maya civilization. The largest cities are at their largest. The artistic tradition is at its most refined. The astronomical and mathematical sciences are at their most precise. The hieroglyphic literature is being carved and painted, and folded into bark paper books, in greater quantities than ever before. In other ways, the cracks are already visible, although nobody this morning knows quite what they are. The agricultural systems that support Tikal's enormous population are operating very near their environmental limits. The forest, although it looks unchanged, has been slowly degrading for centuries. Soil erosion in the surrounding hills is accelerating. The droughts of the last 50 years have been longer than usual. Within 50 years of this particular morning, by the year 800, the population of Tikal will have begun to decline. Within 150 years, by the year 900, it will be substantially abandoned. Within 200 years, by the year 950, almost no one will live there at all. The pyramid we are looking at this morning, the resting place of Chichén Itzá, will stand alone in the forest, slowly losing its painted plaster, slowly being colonized by trees. The forest will eventually almost completely cover it. This is the slow forgetting we have come tonight to follow. The Maya were not, of course, born in the year 750. Their civilization had, by the morning we have just visited, been developing for nearly 3,000 years already. To understand them, we have to walk back, briefly, through the long preliminary centuries that produced the cities of the Classic period. The deep archaeological record of the Maya region begins in what scholars now call the preclassic period, roughly 2000 before the birth of Christ to 250 after. The early preclassic, between roughly 2000 and 1000 before Christ, saw the slow spread of agriculture across the lowland forest. The Maya domesticated, or adopted from elsewhere, the central agricultural complex of Mesoamerica, maize, beans and squash, the so-called Three Sisters, planted together in the same milpa field, with the maize stalks supporting the bean vines and the squash leaves shading out the weeds. They added, over centuries, a long list of other cultivars: chilies, tomatoes, avocados, cacao, papaya, sweet potato, manioc. They learned, gradually, to manage the forest, to coppice useful trees, to maintain orchards, to engineer raised fields in seasonal wetlands. By the Middle Preclassic, between roughly 1000 and 300 before Christ, the population of the Maya region had reached the levels at which complex society becomes possible. Permanent settlements, with stone-walled buildings, with public plazas, with the beginnings of monumental architecture, had begun to appear. The early Maya, at this period, were in close contact with the older Olmec civilization to their north and west, the great mother culture of Mesoamerica, centered along the Gulf Coast of southern Mexico, whose colossal stone heads and sophisticated religious imagery had been exerting influence over their neighbors since the second millennium before Christ. The Olmec contributed, to the early Maya, certain key religious and political ideas. The divine ruler concept, the imagery of the maize god, the iconography of the jaguar, that would, in modified form, persist throughout the entire Maya cultural sequence. By the late Preclassic, between roughly 300 before Christ and 250 after Christ, the Maya had built their first truly enormous cities. The most spectacular of these, only really excavated in detail since the 1970s, was a city in the central Petén called El Mirador. El Mirador, at its peak around the 1st century before Christ, may have had a population of 100,000 or more. It built pyramids of staggering size. The largest, the so-called La Danta complex, contains, by some measures, more cubic volume of construction than the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt. El Mirador was, in many ways, the first Maya superpower. It influenced, by trade, and possibly by direct political dominance, a wide network of smaller pre-classic Maya cities across the central lowlands. And then, sometime in the early 3rd century after Christ, El Mirador was abandoned. We do not know precisely why. Some combination of regional drought, agricultural exhaustion and political collapse seems to have undone it. The great city was largely empty by the early Classic period. It was reoccupied very likely, in much later centuries, but never reclaimed its original importance. It was in effect, the first Maya city to undergo the same kind of slow abandonment that would, 600 years later, claim Tikal and most of its peer cities. The collapse of El Mirador in the late Preclassic is, in many ways, a pre-echo of the great Classic collapse to come. It suggests, on the available evidence, that the patterns of vulnerability that finally undid the Classic Maya were already operating in the lowland forest 2 centuries before the Classic period even began. The Maya cities never quite escaped the underlying ecological constraints of their tropical lowland setting. They could rise, briefly, to enormous size. They could not on the long term sustain themselves there. The Classic period of Maya civilization is conventionally dated, by the markers archaeologists use, from 250 to 900 after Christ. It is the period during which the great lowland cities, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Yaxchilan, Piedras Negras, Caracol, Naranjo, Quirigua, Bonampak, and many others, built their largest pyramids, carved their longest inscriptions, painted their most elaborate murals, and reached their greatest populations. It is, as we have already noted, a fundamentally fragmented, political world. There was never a unified Maya state. The various cities of the classic period were sovereign kingdoms. Ajaw, the title their kings used, simply means lord or ruler. Each city had its own ruling dynasty, often traceable back through inscriptions to a divinely sanctioned founder figure several centuries earlier. Each city worshipped its own particular set of patron deities. Each city was, in some real sense, its own world. But the cities were also intensely interconnected. They traded jade, obsidian, salt, cacao, cotton textiles, polychrome ceramics, jaguar pelts, and a wide range of other goods. They intermarried. The daughters of one city's royal family were often sent as brides, to seal alliances with the rulers of others. They sometimes warred with each other, and the captives taken in war, particularly noble captives, occasionally rival kings, were used in human sacrifice rituals, or kept as humiliated trophies, paraded periodically through the captor's plaza for symbolic abuse before final execution. The political history of the classic Maya we now understand was dominated for several centuries by the rivalry between two great superpower kingdoms. The first was Tikal, in the central Petén, which we have already met. The second was Calakmul, about 100 kilometers north of Tikal, in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche. Calakmul was the seat of what scholars now call the Snake Kingdom, the Carnal dynasty, whose royal emblem glyph featured the head of a snake. Tikal and Calakmul did not, generally, fight each other directly. Instead, they competed across the entire central Maya lowland, each cultivating its own network of allied subordinate cities, each using its allies to strike at the other's allies. Many of the wars recorded on Maya stele, between cities like Naranjo and Yaxcha, between Caracol and Naranjo, between Dos Pilas and various rivals, were in fact proxy conflicts in this larger Tikal-Calakmul Cold War. The high point of Calakmul's power came in the 7th century, when a Calakmul allied coalition successfully attacked and defeated Tikal itself, in a series of campaigns culminating in the year 562 after Christ. After that defeat, Tikal entered a long period of political eclipse, the so-called Tikal hiatus, during which no new royal stelae were carved at the city for nearly a century and a half. Calakmul in those years was the dominant power in the central Maya world. Then, in the early 8th century, Tikal recovered. The king Jasor Chan Kawil, who had taken the throne in 682, finally defeated Calakmul in a great battle in 736, the climactic battle of which was fought near a secondary site called Naranjo. Calakmul never recovered. Its later kings continued to rule, but the Great Snake dynasty was permanently weakened. Tikal entered the brief Golden Age, the late classic florescence, that we glimpsed at the beginning of this evening's story. But Tikal was never the whole Maya world. We should walk briefly to several of the other great classic cities to get a sense of the variety. Palenque, on the western edge of the Maya world, in what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, was a smaller but artistically more refined city than Tikal. Its great king was Quinichjane Pakal, known to modern admirers simply as Pakal the Great, who ruled for 68 years between 615 and 683. Pakal commissioned the construction of the Temple of the Inscriptions, an elegant pyramid in the central Palenque Plaza, beneath which his own enormous carved stone sarcophagus was concealed. The sarcophagus lid, discovered intact by the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz in 1952, is one of the great masterpieces of Maya stone carving. It shows Tikal, at the moment of his death, falling backward into the open mouth of the underworld, with the world tree rising above him, its branches studded with the iconography of the Maya cosmos. Tikal lived to be, almost certainly, 80 years old. A remarkable lifespan for any pre-modern individual, royal or otherwise. He was when archaeological excavation finally reached him in the 20th century, still wearing his elaborate jade death mask, with jade in his mouth, jade rings on his fingers, jade beads woven into the fabric of his shroud. He had, by every available measure, the most spectacular royal burial that has ever been found anywhere in the Maya world. He was, by every available measure, also one of the most successful kings the Maya ever produced. Under his reign, Palenque expanded its territory, built most of its major monuments, refined its court culture to an extraordinary degree, and produced the long inscriptions on the walls of the Temple of the Inscriptions that would eventually, in the 20th century, become some of the foundational evidence for the modern decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing. Copan, in what is now western Honduras, was the southernmost of the great Maya cities. It was, geographically, on the edge of the Maya world. Beyond Copan, the country was no longer Maya at all. The Copan dynasty, founded by a king named Kinich Yaxcoch Mo, who arrived in 426 after Christ, possibly as an emissary or installed dynast from far-off Teotihuacan in central Mexico, ruled for 16 generations before its final decline in the early 9th century. Copan is famous, today, for two things. The first is the so-called hieroglyphic stairway, a long stone staircase, ascending the side of a temple pyramid, every riser of which is inscribed with hieroglyphic text. It contains the longest single Maya hieroglyphic inscription in the world, roughly 2,200 glyphs, recording the genealogy and history of the Copan dynasty in extraordinary detail. The hieroglyphic stairway was, for almost 1,000 years after Copan was abandoned, partially collapsed and rearranged by treefall and erosion, with the result that modern attempts to read the inscription required the painstaking resequencing of glyph blocks across an entire surface. The reconstruction, finally completed in the late 20th century, is one of the great achievements of modern Maya archaeology. The second thing Copan is famous for is its astonishing portrait sculpture. The kings of Copan, particularly the great 18-rabbit king, Huaxeclajun Uba Kawil, who ruled in the early 8th century, commissioned for themselves an extraordinary series of three-dimensional standing portraits in the round, carved in volcanic tuff, 15 feet tall, in elaborate ceremonial regalia. These statues are unlike almost any other Maya sculpture. They are emphatically individual. They are, in their bulk and their realism, more like Roman portrait busts than like the symbolic frontal sculptures of most Maya monuments. They are some of the most striking pieces of pre-Columbian art the Americas have produced. The 18-rabbit king himself, the man who commissioned most of them, was eventually captured and executed by the king of a smaller neighboring city, Quirigua, in 738 after Christ. One of the most stunning political reversals of the entire classic period, in which a much smaller city defeated and decapitated the king of a great power. The Quirigua victory, however, did not lead to long-term Quirigua dominance. It was simply a strange, embarrassing, isolated event in the long Copan story. Before we follow the Maya into their slow eventual collapse, let us spend a few moments with the things they did intellectually. Because the Maya were, in their abstract thought, one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever produced, and many of the things they did were, demonstrably, original, developed independently from any influence outside the Mesoamerican cultural area. The first is the calendar. The Maya did not invent the basic Mesoamerican calendar. That calendar was inherited by the early Maya from older cultures including the Olmec and the Zapotec. But the Maya systematized and elaborated it more thoroughly than any other Mesoamerican civilization. The Maya operated, simultaneously, two distinct calendars. The first was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar, made by combining a sequence of 13 numbers with a sequence of 20 day names. The reasons for the 260-day length are debated. Possibilities include the length of a human pregnancy, a particular astronomical cycle, or some abstract mathematical preference. Whatever its origin, the 260-day Tzolk'in was the principal Maya divinatory calendar, and it was used to determine the ritual significance of every day, the appropriate days for various ceremonies, and the destinies of children born on particular dates. The second calendar was the Harb, a 365-day solar calendar made of 18 months of 20 days each, plus a final 5-day period at the end of the year considered uniquely unlucky. The Harb approximated the solar year, although the Maya did not insert leap days, with the result that the Harb slowly rotated through the seasons over centuries. The two calendars together produced what scholars call the calendar round, a 52-year cycle in which any given combination of Tzolk'in and Harb dates would only repeat every 52 years. The calendar round was the basic cyclical timekeeping framework of all Mesoamerican civilizations. The Maya, however, also developed a third calendar that the other Mesoamerican civilizations did not have, or had only in vestigial form. This was the long count, a non-cyclical linear day count that started from a mythological zero date corresponding to the 11th of August, 3114 before the birth of Christ, and that continued, day by day, indefinitely into the future. The long count counted in days, in 20-day units called winals, in 360-day units called tons, in 20-ton units called katoons, in 20 katoon units called baktoons, and, occasionally, in still larger units, piktoons, kalabtoons, kinchiltoons, alautoons, that ran into truly cosmic timespans. This long count was, in its day-by-day precision and in its non-cyclical extension, one of the most remarkable timekeeping systems any civilization had developed at the time. The Maya astronomers used it to precisely date eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and other recurring astronomical events. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, to within a single day per 5 centuries of accuracy. They calculated the lunar month with similar precision. They did all of this without any kind of mechanical instrument, more sophisticated than wooden sighting sticks and crossed strings. The mathematics that supported these calculations was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily sophisticated. The Maya used a vigesimal base 20 number system with 3 symbols: a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a stylized shell for 0. The Maya 0 is one of the most important intellectual achievements of any civilization, the independent invention of 0. The concept of a number representing the absence of quantity, used as a placeholder in positional notation, happened in human history only 3 times. It happened, first, in Babylonia, sometime in the 2nd millennium before Christ. It happened, second, in India, sometime in the early centuries of the 1st millennium after Christ. It happened, third, among the Maya of Mesoamerica, sometime in the early classic period. Independently of either of the other 2 inventions, with no known cultural contact, in a different geometric symbol, applied to a different positional system. The Maya 0 allowed them to write, with positional notation, arbitrarily large numbers, using only 3 glyphs. It is one of the principal pieces of evidence that abstract mathematical reasoning is, in some real sense, a universal human capacity, repeatedly invented by different civilizations under appropriate cultural conditions. The Maya hieroglyphic writing system was, on its own terms, equally remarkable. It was a logosyllabic script, meaning that some of its glyphs represented whole words and concepts, while others represented syllables. By the late Classic period, the Maya had developed perhaps 800 distinct glyphs, of which roughly 250 were in regular use. The script could record any spoken sentence in the Mayan languages of the lowlands, with reasonable phonetic precision, and could be used for everything from royal genealogies to ritual prayers to historical narratives to astronomical tables. Maya writing was, for almost 1,000 years after the Classic collapse, completely unreadable. The early Spanish missionaries had, in the late 16th century, made some sporadic attempts to record native pronunciations of the script. Most famously, a Franciscan bishop named Diego de Landa, working in the Yucatan in the 1560s, asked his Maya informants to give him the glyphs corresponding to each letter of the Spanish alphabet, and recorded their answers in a manuscript that survived. But Landa's manuscript was misinterpreted by later European scholars for centuries. They assumed the Maya glyphs were a true alphabet, and the actual script remained largely opaque. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing is one of the great intellectual stories of the 20th century. It happened gradually, in stages, through the patient work of scholars in many countries. Most importantly, the Russian linguist Yuri Knorozov, who in the early 1950s realized that Landa's manuscript actually recorded syllables, not letters. The Russian-American art historian Tatiana Proskoryakov, who in the early 1960s demonstrated that the inscriptions were not mythology but actual political history. And the American epigrapher David Stewart, who as a teenager in the early 1980s made a series of breakthrough By the early 1990s, almost all surviving Maya inscriptions could be read. What they recorded was, in many cases, royal politics, the births, accessions, military campaigns, ritual events, and deaths of the various Classic period kings. But they also recorded in some places prayers, mythological narratives, astronomical observations, and personal reflections. The deciphered Maya inscriptions are, by simple cumulative volume, one of the largest indigenous textual corpora in the entire pre-Columbian Americas. They are still being read tonight. Now, having walked through the high noon of Maya civilization, we have to follow it into the long, strange afternoon of its decline. The classic Maya collapse, as historians and archaeologists call it, was not a single event. It was a slow, regional, staggered process that played out across roughly 150 years, between approximately 750 and 950 after Christ. During that period, almost every major Classic period city in the central and southern Maya lowlands, the Petén, southern Yucatan, parts of Belize and Honduras, was substantially or entirely abandoned. The pattern was uneven. Some cities collapsed earlier than others, and a few smaller sites maintained reduced populations for centuries longer. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The great cities emptied out, the hieroglyphic inscriptions stopped being carved, the forest grew back. What caused the collapse is one of the most extensively studied questions in all of pre-Columbian archaeology. There is no single accepted answer. The most plausible explanation, on the basis of the evidence as it currently stands, involves the convergence of several different factors over several generations. The first factor is climate. Paleoclimate research, particularly the analysis of lake sediment cores from the Petén, has demonstrated that the late 9th and early 10th centuries saw a series of unusually severe and prolonged droughts in the Maya lowlands. Some of these droughts may have lasted decades. The Maya, whose agricultural system depended heavily on the annual rainy season, were extremely vulnerable to such variations. A few bad years in succession could exhaust the food reserves of a city. A decade-long drought could depopulate it. The second factor is environmental degradation. The Maya, for centuries, had been clearing forest for milpa cultivation in patterns that, on long timescales, exhausted soils and damaged the regional water cycle. By the 8th century, the population pressure on the Petén landscape was historically unprecedented. The forest, which had until then been able to regenerate between agricultural cycles, was, by the late Classic, increasingly unable to do so. Soil erosion accelerated. The reservoirs that supplied the cities became silted with eroded soil. The water table dropped. The third factor is warfare. The political fragmentation we discussed earlier, the constant low-level conflict between rival city-states, escalated in the late Classic into more frequent and more destructive wars. By the 8th century, defensive fortifications were appearing around cities that had not previously needed them. Royal stelae increasingly emphasized military victories. Captives, including kings, were being humiliated and sacrificed in greater numbers. The political system, which had functioned for centuries on a relatively stable equilibrium between rival kingdoms, seems to have entered, in the 8th century, a period of escalating instability. The fourth factor, and this is the most speculative, although also one of the most discussed, is the failure of royal legitimacy. The Maya king, the Kuhul Ajaw, was understood as a sacred figure, whose ritual performances maintained the cosmic order. The king was responsible, in particular, for the rains. When the droughts began, when the harvests failed, when the wars went badly, the people of the cities may have lost faith, slowly, in the religious system that had justified the entire elaborate apparatus of divine kingship. The great pyramid temples, the complex public ceremonies, the long carved stelae, all of this had been an enormous investment of social labor in support of a ritual ideology. As the ideology lost credibility, the labor was no longer forthcoming. The cities could not, without that labor, sustain themselves. Probably all four factors were operating, in various combinations in different regions at different times. The net result, across the central lowlands, was the same. The cities could not maintain their populations. The populations dispersed, presumably to smaller agricultural settlements, or migrated north into the Yucatan, or south into the Guatemalan highlands. The cities were left empty. The forest grew back over them. It is, in retrospect, one of the most thorough urban abandonments in the archaeological record of any major civilization. Within a few centuries of the collapse, the central Maya lowlands had reverted to a landscape of small villages and primary forest, with the abandoned cities serving primarily as occasional pilgrimage sites for the descendants of the people who had once lived in them. The hieroglyphic writing system, which had been flourishing for centuries, was no longer being used to carve new monuments. The long count calendar, which had been operating without interruption for nearly 1,000 years, was no longer being kept up to date. Some of the technical knowledge that had supported these institutions, particularly the more abstract astronomical and mathematical sciences, may simply have been lost, with the scribes who carried it dying without successors. The collapse was, however, not the end of Maya civilization. The descendants of the Classic period Maya continued to live in the region. Smaller communities in the Petén persisted for centuries. The Maya population of the northern Yucatan in particular, which had been a peripheral region during the Classic period, actually grew during the centuries of central lowland decline, as displaced lowlanders migrated north and joined the existing northern Maya communities. The result was the Postclassic period, between roughly 900 and the Spanish conquest of the early 16th century. The political center of gravity of the Maya world shifted north, to the Yucatan Peninsula. The two great post-classic cities, Chichén Itzá and Mayapan, were both in the northern Yucatan. They were different in character from the classic period lowland cities, smaller, more militarized, with more obvious external influences from central Mexico. But they were continuous, in language and in culture, with the older Maya tradition. Chichén Itzá in the northern Yucatan became the dominant Maya city of the early post-classic period, between roughly 900 and 1250 after Christ. It is, even tonight, the most famous Maya archaeological site for casual visitors. Its great central pyramid, the so-called Castillo, with its serpent-headed staircases that produce a famous shadow effect at the spring and autumn equinoxes, has become the iconic image of Maya civilization in modern tourist culture. Chichén Itzá, its architecture and iconography, show clear influences from central Mexico, particularly from the city of Tula, the capital of the Toltec civilization that flourished in central Mexico during the same period. The exact nature of the relationship between the Toltecs and the Itzá Maya is still debated. The traditional theory, developed in the early 20th century, was that Toltec invaders from central Mexico had militarily conquered Chichén Itzá and imposed their own culture on the local population. More recent scholarship has tended to see the relationship as more complex, perhaps a peaceful exchange of elite culture, perhaps a shared Mesoamerican international style, rather than a simple invasion. But the architectural evidence is unmistakable. Serpent columns, chacmul sculptures, tzompantli skull racks, and other distinctively Toltec elements appear at Chichén Itzá in forms strikingly similar to their central Mexican parallels. Chichén Itzá itself was, by the middle of the 13th century, declining. It was succeeded, as the political center of the northern Maya world, by another city about 100 kilometers to the west. Mayapan, which was built in the late 1200s, and abandoned in the mid-1400s after a violent civil war. By the time the Spaniards arrived in the early 16th century, the northern Yucatan was no longer ruled by any single great city. It was divided into approximately 16 small regional kingdoms, each with its own ruler and its own loose territorial control, none of them resembling in scale or sophistication the great classic period centers of the central lowlands. This is the Maya world the Spanish conquistadors encountered. The Spanish first arrived in the Maya region in 1511, when a small expedition under Diego de Nicueza wrecked on the coast of Yucatan, and most of its survivors were killed or enslaved by the local Maya. A handful escaped, most famously a Spaniard named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who lived among the Maya for 8 years before being recovered by Hernán Cortés in 1519, and who served, alongside the indigenous Maya woman known to history as La Malinche, as one of Cortés's principal interpreters during the conquest of the Aztec Empire. The conquest of Yucatan proper, however, came considerably later than the conquest of central Mexico. Cortés himself, after defeating the Aztecs in 1521, made an extraordinary expedition through the southern Maya lowlands in 1525. A long and remarkable journey on which he encountered, among other things, the small Maya kingdom of Tayasal in the central Petén, on an island in the middle of a lake, but he did not attempt a serious conquest of the Maya region. The actual military conquest of the Yucatan was undertaken by a separate Spanish expedition, led by Francisco de Montejo and his son. The Montejos arrived in 1527. They spent the next 20 years fighting a slow, exhausting, often unsuccessful campaign against the various small Maya kingdoms of the peninsula. The Maya, despite being technologically far behind the Spanish in metallurgy and in the use of horses and firearms, were, in the dense jungle terrain of the Yucatan, surprisingly difficult to defeat. They had no central state for the Spanish to capture. Each kingdom had to be reduced separately. Repeated Spanish withdrawals, abandoned settlements, and major Maya counterattacks marked the long campaign. The capital of Mérida was finally founded by the Montejos in 1542, on the site of an older Maya town called Tijo. The conquest of most of the northern Yucatan was nominally complete by 1546, although significant Maya resistance continued in scattered form for several decades after that. The southern Maya highlands in modern Guatemala had been conquered separately in the 1520s, by another Spanish force under Pedro de Alvarado. The conquest of these regions, taken together, ended Maya political independence in most of the Maya world. But not all of it. The small kingdom of the Itzá Maya, descendants of the post-classic rulers of Chichén Itzá, who had withdrawn to the lake island of Tikal in the central Petén, remained independent throughout the entire period of the Spanish conquest of the rest of the Maya world. They preserved in their isolated jungle setting the older Maya culture in much of its traditional form, including, by some accounts, working hieroglyphic books and a functioning long-count calendar. Tikal was finally conquered by a Spanish expedition under Martín de Ursúa in 1697. It was the last independent indigenous polity in all of Mesoamerica. Its conquest, which received almost no contemporary attention compared with the conquests of the Aztecs and the Inca, is in some ways the actual end of the long Mesoamerican story we have been tracing for thousands of years. 207 years after Columbus, the last Maya king surrendered, and the entire region, from the Rio Grande to Guatemala, was at last under Spanish colonial administration. Of all the things the Spanish did in the Maya region, the most consequential for our knowledge of pre-conquest Maya civilization was the destruction of the books. The Maya had, by the time of the Spanish arrival, an extensive tradition of folded bark paper books, accordion-folded codices made from amet paper, painted on both sides with hieroglyphic text, and elaborate polychrome illustrations. These books contained, by the available evidence, astronomical tables, ritual calendars, mythological narratives, historical chronicles, and probably much else. They were the principal form of literacy in the late pre-conquest Maya world. There must have been, at the time of the conquest, hundreds or thousands of them. The Spanish missionaries, who saw these books as instruments of pagan superstition, systematically destroyed them. The most famous single incident occurred in the year 1562, in the Yucatan town of Maní, where the Franciscan provincial Diego de Landa, a man whose name we have already encountered, since the same Landa later wrote one of the principal early Spanish accounts of Maya civilization, held an auto de fe in the central plaza. He had collected, by various coercive means, 27 Maya hieroglyphic codices and roughly 5,000 religious objects from the surrounding region. He burned them all, in a single bonfire, in front of an assembled crowd of Maya and Spaniards. He recorded the fact in his own subsequent writings, expressing some satisfaction at having eradicated so much paganism in a single afternoon. The Maya, who had clearly understood the cultural significance of what was happening, are reported to have wept. Landa noted this fact, and was confused by it. Of all the pre-conquest Maya hieroglyphic codices that once existed, exactly 4 are known to survive. They are now preserved in libraries in Dresden, in Madrid, in Paris, and the most recently authenticated, accepted as genuine only in 2018 after some decades of scholarly doubt, in Mexico City. Together, they total fewer than 300 pages of pre-conquest Maya text. Everything else, The entire literary, scientific, ritual, and historical written tradition of a civilization that produced books for several centuries is gone, destroyed in fires lit by Spanish friars who could not read what they were burning. The 4 surviving codices are precious beyond easy measure. The Dresden Codex, the most famous, contains detailed astronomical tables for Venus, for the Moon, for solar eclipses, that have been crucial for the modern reconstruction of Maya scientific thought. The Madrid Codex contains ritual almanacs and divinatory tables. The Paris Codex contains a fragmentary chronicle of cartoon periods, the 20-year units of the long count, with their associated prophecies. The Mexico City Codex, called the Grolier, or now the Maya Codex of Mexico, contains a Venus table, similar to but not identical with the one in the Dresden Codex. These 4 books, taken together, constitute the entire surviving textual evidence for pre-conquest Maya literary culture in its native form. The thousands of inscriptions on stone monuments, although extensive, do not generally cover the same kinds of material. The inscriptions are public, ceremonial texts, while the books contain the more private, technical, scholarly knowledge of the priesthood. The loss of those books is one of the great cultural catastrophes of the early colonial period, comparable in its long-term impact only to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. The colonial period of Maya history, from roughly 1546 to the Mexican independence in 1821, was one of slow demographic catastrophe and gradual cultural adaptation. Disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, killed, in the first century of contact, perhaps 80 to 90% of the indigenous population of the Yucatan. The Maya who survived were drawn into the Spanish encomienda system, which extracted their labor for Spanish landholders. Catholic missionaries, initially Franciscans, later Jesuits, converted them to Christianity, gradually but thoroughly, although the resulting Maya Catholicism retained many elements of the older religious tradition in syncretic combination. After Mexican independence in 1821, the situation of the Yucatan Maya did not particularly improve. The new Mexican state, dominated by white and mestizo elites, expanded haciendas at the expense of communal Maya lands, intensified the exploitation of Maya labor in henequen plantations, and generally treated the indigenous population with contempt. In the summer of 1847, a regional uprising broke out among the Maya peasantry of the eastern Yucatan. It is now called the Caste War of Yucatan. It was, in scale and intensity, one of the largest indigenous rebellions in the entire history of the Americas after independence. The Maya rebels, led at various points by Cecilio Chi, Jacinto Pat, and others, drove the Mexican state out of most of the eastern Yucatan within the first year of fighting. They came close in the late spring of 1848 to driving the Mexicans out of the entire peninsula. The rebellion was, at the last moment, blunted by an unexpected military reversal in the summer of 1848, when the Maya forces, on the eve of their final assault on Mérida, pulled back to plant their corn. The rains had come. The agricultural calendar took precedence over the military campaign. By the time the Maya armies returned to the field in the autumn, the Mexican army had reorganized and received reinforcements. The Maya advance was halted. The Caste War, however, did not end in 1848. It ground on, in increasingly attritional form, for the next half-century. The Maya rebels withdrew eastward, into a region of dense forest along the Caribbean coast, where they established a de facto independent state, centered on a settlement called Chan Santa Cruz. This state, ruled by a peculiar religious institution called the Cult of the Speaking Cross, a syncretic Catholic Maya religion built around oracular communications from a wooden cross, maintained autonomous control of much of what is now the Mexican state of Quintana Roo for nearly 50 years. It was finally subdued by the Mexican army in 1901. The last Maya holdout settlements were occupied by Mexican forces around 1904. Even after this final defeat, however, the Caste War did not really end. Maya communities in the region maintained, for decades, an attitude of guarded autonomy and selective non-cooperation toward the Mexican state. The deep cultural memory of the war, and of the temporary Maya independence at Chichén Santa Cruz, remains alive in modern Yucatec Maya communities. There are still Maya families today who can recite the names of their ancestors who fought in the rebellion. While the Caste War was beginning, an extraordinary process of European rediscovery of the lost classic Maya was also underway. The classic period Maya cities had, by the early 19th century, been almost completely forgotten by everyone except local indigenous populations. The Spanish colonial administration knew about a few of the Yucatan sites, Chichén Itzá, Uxmal, that were too prominent to ignore. But the great cities of the southern lowlands, hidden under jungle for nearly 1,000 years, were largely unknown to outsiders. In 1839, an American lawyer and travel writer named John Lloyd Stephens, who had previously written successful travel books about the Near East and Eastern Europe, was appointed by the United States as a special diplomatic envoy to the Federal Republic of Central America, a short-lived political union covering modern Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Stephens had heard rumors of ancient ruins in the region. He decided to investigate. He brought with him an English architectural artist named Frederick Catherwood, who had previously made detailed drawings of ruins in Egypt, Petra, and Jerusalem. Stephens and Catherwood traveled together for 2 extended journeys through the Maya region, in 1839 to 1840, and again in 1841 to 1842. They visited Copan, Quirigua, Palenque, Uxmal, Chichén Itzá, and many smaller sites. Catherwood, working under terrible conditions of heat and mosquitoes and tropical disease, made an extraordinary series of detailed architectural drawings of the buildings and inscriptions they found. Stephens wrote, on his return, 2 books, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, published in 1841, and Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, published in 1843, that established, for the first time in the English-speaking world, the existence and the scale of the lost Maya civilization. Stephens's books were international bestsellers. They went through dozens of editions. Catherwood's illustrations, reproduced as engravings in the books, became the principal visual source through which the Maya entered the Western imagination. The patient, accurate, beautifully composed drawings of the hieroglyphic stairway at Copan, of the inscriptions at Palenque, of the carved facades of Uxmal, gave the educated public of Europe and North America their first reliable picture of what these places had actually been. Stephens, in his books, made one further argument that has, in retrospect, been spectacularly vindicated by all subsequent research. Earlier European writers, when forced to acknowledge the existence of monumental American ruins, had often attributed them to lost colonies of various Old World peoples, to the Phoenicians, to the Egyptians, to the lost tribes of Israel, to refugees from Atlantis. Stephens, almost alone among 19th-century travelers, insisted that the Maya cities had been built by the ancestors of the Maya people, who still lived in the same region. The civilization, he argued, was indigenous, autonomous, and not in any way a derivative of Old World cultures. He was right. Almost everything we have learned, in the 180 years since, has confirmed his judgment. The Maya civilization is, in its essentials, an independent invention. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing. which we touched on earlier, is in some ways the most remarkable single intellectual story of 20th century Mesoamerican studies. It was a slow, collaborative, often quarrelsome process that took most of the 20th century to complete. But by the early 1990s, the Maya glyphic system was, in its essentials, fully readable. The story has heroes. We have already met some of them. Yuri Knorozov, a young Russian linguist working in Stalinist Leningrad in the late 1940s. He was a student who had worked, briefly, in the Berlin State Library at the very end of the Second World War, and who is supposed to have personally rescued, from a burning building, a copy of Diego de Landa's manuscript, and one of the printed editions of the Dresden Codex. Argued, in a series of papers published between 1952 and 1963, that the Maya script was logosyllabic, and could be read phonetically. Knorozov worked, throughout his life, in almost complete isolation from the international Mayanist community. He never visited a Maya site. He read the Dresden Codex from a printed photographic edition. But he was, on the central question of how the script worked, more correct than any of the Western scholars who had been studying it for a century. Tatiana Proskoryakov, a Russian-born American art historian working at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, made the second great breakthrough. In 1960, she published a paper in American Antiquity, arguing that the inscriptions on the stelae at the Maya site of Piedras Negras did not record mythology, as had previously been believed. They recorded the actual political history of actual kings, births, accessions, military campaigns, deaths, patterned in clear cycles that corresponded to royal lifespans. With Proskoryakov's argument, the Maya inscriptions ceased to be ritual abstraction, and became, instead, history. The monuments could now be read as the political documents of real human beings. The full systematic decipherment, building on Knorozov's and Proskoryakov's work, was carried forward by a small group of mostly American epigraphers in the 1970s and 1980s. Linda Shilley, David Stewart, Peter Matthews, Floyd Lounsbury, and many others. By the late 1980s, almost every glyph in the corpus could be read with phonetic precision. The names of the kings, the places, the gods, the events, all of it was, finally, recoverable. What this means, in human terms, is that we now know more than 700 individual classic period Maya kings by name. We know their family relationships. We know their accession dates. We know when they fought their wars and what those wars accomplished. We can read, on the carved stones of cities that have been silent for 1,000 years, the personal voices of kings who lived and died with the certainty that their words would be remembered forever. Their words, in fact, were remembered forever. There was simply a 1,000-year gap between the carving and the reading. We have come to the end of our story. It has been a long walk. We began this evening in 750 after Christ, with a quiet morning over the city of Tikal. We have followed since then the long preclassic origins, the rise of the classic city-states, the brilliance of the Maya intellectual tradition, the slow collapse of the central lowland cities, the migration north into the Yucatan, the rise and fall of Chichén Itzá and Mayapan, the Spanish encounter and the long slow conquest, the burning of the codices by Diego de Landa, the Caste War of the 19th century, the rediscovery by Stevens and Catherwood, and the 20th century decipherment of the hieroglyphic script. It is, in scale, a story spanning more than 3,000 years. It is also, in some essential way, a story that has not ended. The Maya have not vanished. There are, today, somewhere between 6 and 8 million speakers of approximately 30 distinct Mayan languages, living in southern Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, and parts of Honduras. They are the largest indigenous linguistic group in the modern Americas. They farm, they weave, they keep their own calendars, in some communities, alongside the Gregorian one. They have, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, undergone something of a cultural and political revival. Maya activists in Guatemala have been increasingly vocal in claiming political rights, recovering ancestral lands, and reasserting cultural identity. The Guatemalan Civil War of the late 20th century, which involved enormous violence against indigenous communities by the US-backed military government, was one of the most painful chapters in modern Maya history. The formal recognition of those events by the post-war Guatemalan state, although incomplete, has been a partial step toward acknowledgement. The cities of the classic period are, today, archaeological parks. Tikal has been partially excavated since the 1950s. About 20% of its central area has been cleared of forest and consolidated. The rest is still under canopy. Walking through Tikal at dawn, the same dawn, in some real sense, that we visited at the beginning of this evening's broadcast, you can hear the howler monkeys begin their roaring just before sunrise, and the dim shapes of the Great Pyramids slowly emerge from the morning mist. And you can stand in the same great plaza where Yikinchan Kawil stood, and you can climb the same temple where his father is buried, and you can look out over the same forest that 1500 years ago was the subject of his royal rituals. Most of the smaller classic cities, and there are dozens of them, scattered across the Petén and the surrounding lowlands, are still substantially unexcavated. Some have not been excavated at all. LiDAR remote sensing surveys beginning around 2015 have begun to reveal the full scale of the classic Maya urban network. Many of the unexcavated cities are larger than previously believed, and there are many more of them than previously believed. The forest, which obscured them for 1,000 years, is still concealing most of them. They are still, in the strictest sense, lost cities. But the Maya themselves are not lost. They are still here, they are still speaking. They are still in their own small communities, keeping the patient timekeeping that their civilization began nearly 5,000 years ago. The long count is still being kept, in some communities, not in stone monuments, but in the memories of ritual specialists. The Tzolk'in is still being used, for divinatory purposes, by traditional Maya priests called daykeepers, in highland Guatemalan villages, and across the Yucatan. The system of timekeeping that we have followed tonight, the great cyclical machine of Mesoamerican calendars, is, in some communities, still running, day by day, exactly as it has been running since before the rise of Tikal. That, perhaps, is the deepest legacy of the Maya, not the cities, although those have lasted, not the writing, although that has been recovered, but the simple continuity of a people who have been counting the days, in the same patient cycle of 20 named days and 13 numbers, since long before the founding of Rome, and long after the fall of every empire we have followed in these long evenings. We are at the end now. Take a moment, if you are still awake, to soften your shoulders, to unclench your jaw, to let the day again go. If you are not still awake, that perhaps is the better outcome. We did not promise you a history, we promised you a sleep. The history was simply the carriage in which the sleep arrived. In a moment this will end, there will be silence, the music will fade. Then, in another moment, this will begin again, for the next listener, somewhere else, in another quiet evening. The history, like the days that the daykeepers count, does not end. It only continues, in some other room. We are very glad you came, we are very glad you stayed, we hope you sleep deeply and well. Good night, from the Drowsy Historian.